Hello, Christ Church of the Valley, and welcome to the third devotion in the book of Romans. I'm so grateful that we get to still have time together in the Bible. I've been thoroughly enjoying going back over the book of Romans, going through my old Bible school notes, but also just reading and thinking about bringing some things out of the text. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining me again, and we'll get into the book of Romans. Now, you may have noticed that oftentimes during a sermon, a pastor will read from the scriptures, he'll explain some things, and then he'll give some more "how then shall we live" kind of thoughts. And especially in the book of Romans lends itself to "how then shall we live" kind of ideas and so forth. But you'll notice that's not been so much my point here. We have two fields. We have hermeneutics, which has to do with reading and interpreting. We then also have homiletics. And homiletics is taking what you just researched and presenting it in a way that gives some "how then shall we live" kind of feeling or idea to it. And really what I'm more doing here is the one side. We're going through the text, we're bringing some things out, and although I am giving some illustrations, the "how then shall we live," I'm not so much focusing on that, but really just kind of focusing on the book of Romans and what the book of Romans means, and letting you to kind of think about, well, what does that mean then in my life? So with that, let's go ahead and start. Now, it was my intention originally to finish chapter 1 today. However, I was just working through it and felt like, there's just too much stuff here to do in one more foul swoop. So we're going to break this up. This will be Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. And then next time we'll finish Romans chapter 1. Now, to speak again a little bit about the background and why the setting and the background are so important. Now, when we think about, for example, the letter to the Galatians, which I personally date before the Council of Jerusalem in about 50 AD, Acts chapter 15, primarily because Paul doesn't refer to anything that would suggest that the Council of Jerusalem has already happened. It seems like Galatians is kind of that setting off point that's going to push Paul and the church to have that Acts chapter 15 council. Now, what we can tell is going on in the Galatian region or the Galatian churches is that there are Gentile Christians and they're being influenced by Jewish Christians. These Jewish Christians are insisting on Jewish things like circumcision, probably kosher laws, things of that nature. And Paul has to set the record straight for the Galatians that no, those things are not part of the new covenant. Now, when it comes to the book of Romans, like I've said in other videos, we don't have specifics. But it seems that Paul is about to make sure that the playing field is level. And what I mean by that is, although in the book of Romans, Paul is going to point out that God started his plan with the Jews, both Gentile and Jew need Christ, or need Jesus in the new covenant, and levels the need. So that being said, what we're about to get into, starting in Romans chapter 1 verse 18 and going through the end of the chapter, is Paul is about to give a completely thorough critique of paganism. You're going to see Paul pointing both to a Jewish concept, which then is part of Paul's understanding of the Jesus, the Christian message of the new covenant, creational monotheism. We are Christians. There is still one God, only one God. You see this here in chapter 1 verse 20, and then it's repeated in 25. Nothing in all of creation can contain God, ergo any kind of idolatry is necessarily false. Now, what would it mean for something to contain God, and what would it mean for something to be idolatry? Now, interestingly, Paul's going to touch on that, and we're going to develop that thought as we go through here. Now, of course, we see this little hint here, this little glimmer about image, and some other language here in Paul is going to tell us what Paul is probably thinking when he writes this. And one thing that Paul wants to stress is that the image bearer, if anything in all of creation could even come close to containing God, and I don't actually even want to finish that sentence, but nothing can contain God. But one thing in God's creation can reflect God's image. And that thing that can reflect God's image would, of course, be the image bearer, the male and the female that bear the image of God. That image bearer, though, can be completely corrupted. And paganism corrupts humanity completely. Now, we're not going to get all the way to these points now, but I just want to point out that Paul's thoughts, corrupting of God's order, verses 26 and 27, and corruption of all of God's order, verses 28 through 30. We'll begin in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, there's so many things right here from this first sentence that need to be highlighted, need to be brought out. 17 is linked to 18. And oftentimes, like for example, in my study Bible, not only are they broken up in verses, they're also broken up then into another section. And it's kind of easy to miss that 17 and 18 are linked. But you'll notice here in the New American Standard that 18 starts with for, which is not unlike therefore, which oftentimes, especially through the book of Romans, when Paul says therefore, we have to ask what's it there for. But there's another link going on here between 17 and 18. You'll notice that in 17, the righteousness of God is revealed. Here in verse 18, though, the wrath of God is revealed. Same word going on here, revealed. Now, wrath of God is not so much a nice idea. People like some of the nice ideas when it comes to the Bible and biblical writings, such as God is love. And it's not that I don't believe God is love. Of course I believe God is love. John writes that God is love. And of course, John 3:16, for God so loved the world. But what else? Not just God so loved the world. God gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but shall have everlasting life. The wrath of God is being revealed against what? Ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Now, people often jump to the idea that God then is pouring out wrath on men, but you miss the point there, that it's against the ungodliness and the unrighteousness that is bringing about God's wrath. Now, one thing that we have to square with, and I don't know how you're going to read Paul if you can't square with this, is that God is holy and sin is sin. And what Paul is going to do here, he's going to build a continual argument. I just tried to use a word that just jumped out of my head. Paul is not going to make one argument and go on to another argument. Paul is going to make a continuous argument building to a main point. And he's going to talk, of course, about salvation and what we're saved from. And that's a big question. What are we saved from when God saves us? Now, if sin is not sin, and sin doesn't separate us from God, and instead sin is just some sort of abstract, archaic concept, and what you need to do is accept the truth that God loves you no matter what, and sin can't separate you from God, that really downgrades then any form of salvation because what are we saved from then? And as Paul continues this, we're going to get into what we are saved from. Now, you'll also notice there in verse 18 that the wrath of God is revealed, which of course is revealed is in the present tense. And that may sound to you like end times language or eschatological language, that the wrath of God is revealed or poured out on people. That sounds very apocalyptic. That sounds very end of the age when God calls sinners to account. And yet here, Paul seems to suggest that the wrath of God is currently being poured out or revealed against the ungodliness and the unrighteousness of men. How? How is it being poured out in the present tense? Well, I'm going to answer this in two ways, and one would be a little bit of development, and two would be, well, let's continue and see what Paul says. But now this first point of how the wrath of God is poured out in the present tense, well, people's lives are a mess. The world is a mess. And why? Why is the world a mess? Why are people's lives a mess? The bottom line is sin. Sin has corrupted the world. Sin has made it so that people are greedy, people are violent, people do horrible things on global scales. When we look at the macro view of the world, we see horrible, terrible things that come about because of sin. The world is not a utopia. And every time somebody tries to build a utopia, you're never going to build utopia without acknowledging that sin corrupts. Now, when we go past the macrocosm and we go into the micro, my life, your life, her life, his life, whose life is not or has not at some point been in a mess because of their own sins or because of the sins of somebody else? You think about, for example, somebody who lives below the poverty line and doesn't get the daily need of food or shelter or things of that nature. Why? Because in this scenario, perhaps dad can't keep a job. Why can't dad keep a job? Because dad's an alcoholic. He goes to work drunk. He gets fired. Drinking is more important to dad than taking care of and providing for his family. And so in that case, people are suffering because somebody is choosing to sin. But we have to be honest about it. We can't just point the finger at other people. I've got to admit that in my life, I have caused myself suffering and I've caused other people suffering because I chose to sin. And so one way that the wrath of God is being poured out is just in the mess that we see our lives and the world in at this point. Verses 19 and 20, we're going to deal with these two together, and we're going to get into this. Now, these two verses, they have some translation troubles, mostly because not unlike in English, Greek words can sometimes have two meanings, and it could be this or it could be that, and I have no desire to end the controversy over these passages. I instead just want to bring some things that we can all agree upon out. So starting in verse 19, because of that, so all that has happened, verses 17 and 18, starting in 19, because of that, because that which is known about God is evident to them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Now, there's so much going on in this passage. Some people have wondered if Paul is referring to what's sometimes called natural theology. And I do believe that at least to some degree or another, Paul is referring to some form of knowledge of God, not based on Scripture, not based on a word from God, but knowledge of God based on creation. And this isn't too far-fetched an idea when you consider his audience, the Gentile audience and the Jewish audience. Because in the Greco-Roman world, by the time Paul is writing, Plato and Aristotle have already put forth that there must be something that brought about creation. There's so much order in the world, and order doesn't just happen randomly. It happens because there's something behind it. Moreover, Cicero, who lived or who was born about 100 years before Jesus, he also had argued that both existence and goodness of existence point to something that transcends existence. And so his Gentile audience reading this letter would probably pick up some Aristotle, some Plato, maybe some Cicero in his words here. And at the same time, the Jewish audience that might have been there in the Church of Rome would also hear Paul's Jewish understanding of creation means creator, and Psalm chapter 19, verses 1 through 6, creation cries out the knowledge of God and points to the fact that there is a God. Now again, I pointed out that there's some issue with how exactly to translate and how exactly to understand. Is Paul saying that there is some form of an innate God knowledge within each person? It's possible that Paul is saying that. I don't know if that's what Paul is saying, mostly because I don't know if that's true. However, I do think that Paul is saying that the order that we see in the universe, the order that we see in our own daily lives and things of that nature, point to the knowledge of God. My wife, when she was in college, she went to the good school in Montana, not that bad school over in Missoula. Boo, bad school over in Missoula. She went to the good college there in Bozeman, Montana, and she got a degree in biology. And the biology at the university was not a Christian biology. It was a secular biology, probably involved natural selection and maybe even Darwinian thought and so forth. And one of her friends at some point asked her, is it hard to be a Christian and to be in a biology class, a secular biology class? And my wife said, no, of course not, because the more she learned about the human body, the more she learned about biology, the more order she saw, and she saw the fingerprints of God in biology or in creation. And I completely agree with that. So, again, Paul is making a cumulative argument, and so it's kind of hard to break these up when Paul is continuing a thought here. But verses 21, 22, and 23. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of bird, of four-footed animals, and of crawling creatures. There's so much there, as you can see. But one thing that is clear in Paul's mind is that humans are culpable. Going back to the verse 18 that mentioned men suppressing the truth. Now, suppression is perhaps too strong of a dynamic equivalent in the English, because suppression would seem to imply that they've been able to suppress the truth. And perhaps suppression in the hindrance sense would be a better understanding of Paul's language there, that they are attempting to hinder, they are attempting to suppress the truth. And even what they know, they are suppressing or attempting to suppress, which of course is a willful and a purposeful decision that they are making. Here, starting in verse 21, they're not even honoring God or giving God thanks. Now, there, when you think about it, you think about a parent and a child, and the parent lays down the rules, you will not behave this way, and the child chooses to behave that way, obviously there are going to be consequences for that. But you also think to yourself here, think about your own existence and so forth. I have to tell you that I ate this morning and I ate yesterday morning, and I have to confess I've missed very few meals over my life. And a meal is something that you need to survive, and it's God who provides. And so when you think about it, the same way that when you were a child and mom or dad made you a peanut butter sandwich for lunch, what of course did you say? You said thank you. And here here Paul is saying that when they suppress the knowledge of God, even though the knowledge of God is there right in front of them, they refuse to honor God, obey God, recognize God's authority, and they refuse to give thanks. But their speculation becomes futile. And here, oddly enough, believe it or not, I believe that Friedrich Nietzsche actually captures this biblical truth in his atheism, and the result being nihilism. And nihilism being, of course, meaningless. Nothing is meaningful. And so even in a world that you have suppressed the knowledge of God, and so there is no God, there can be no ultimate meaning. And even if you ascribe meaning to self-betterment or societal betterment, all that is giving yourself some sort of hope, despite the fact that atheism and suppression of the truth necessarily lead to nihilism. And the question is, can you be a consistent nihilist? I'm not sure that a person can be a consistent nihilist. Look at the language that Paul also uses here in verse 23. They exchange. They choose to do this. They are exchanging what? The glory of the incorruptible God for what? Now here, I also want to point out something else about Paul's language here in verse 23. And that is the threefold: the bird, the four-footed animal, the crawling creatures. That is Genesis chapter 1 language. Birds and creatures and crawling creatures. And with that, the image of God, the image also mentioned here in verse 23, should bring to the reader's mind Genesis chapter 1 image language. Well, what is image language in Genesis chapter 1? That God created male and female, both in the image of God. And that's very key to understanding the rest of Paul's thought as we continue through Romans chapter 1. But bringing this to an end for this study, let's wrap it up with verses 24 and 25. Because of all this, therefore, remember that whenever Paul uses therefore, ask yourself, what is it therefore? Because of all of these things, because they suppress the knowledge of God, because they ignore the knowledge of God which is evident to them, and because they will not acknowledge God or give him thanks, and they have exchanged the glory of God for idolatry, 24, therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their heart, to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored amongst them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. God gave them over. I think that this is exactly how verse 18 started. The wrath of God is being revealed. How is the wrath of God being revealed? God has given people over to their sinful ways. God is also allowing the sin that they plant to bear fruit in their lives and to bear fruit throughout the world. Now, I have to confess, I watched a particular show for a while, and this particular show, it's not a wholesome show. It doesn't give glory to God. But one thing I have to admit that they did capture correctly in this show, and that was that sin always begets sin. sin never begets righteousness. It never begets justice. It always begets more sin. In this particular show, people would sin, and they would sin against another group or another individual. And what did that person do? That person then in turn sinned against them. And this continued the cycle to the final episode of the show, where is he a protagonist or is he an antagonist? You can't really say he's a good guy, but he ends up dead because of the choices that he made throughout all of the seasons of the show. Now, I see that and I say, wow, that actually captures the reality of sin in this fallen world. Paul's language here is very Septuagint language, which makes sense because he's talking to Greek-speaking people who aren't, with the exception of some of the Jews in the audience, the Greek-speaking and Greek-reading audience here in the Roman Church is going to be able to read the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so I think Paul is being influenced by the Greek Septuagint because God handed them over. This is the same language that we see in the Septuagint when God hands people over to their enemies, lets them fall into the hands of their enemies, and things of that nature. Notice that it is the result of people rejecting God. God allows people to reject him, and they then suffer the consequences of their own sins. And God doesn't restrain sin in somebody's life when they have abandoned God. God hands them over. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this meditation from the book of Romans. We'll be back in Romans and we'll wrap up chapter 1. I want to tell you that I appreciate you. Thank you for watching this. I hope that you're doing well during this time. I pray that you stay strong and continue on in your faith. Christ Church of the Valley, I want to say specifically to you, let's stay connected during this time. Do you need a phone call? Do you need an email? Do you need to talk? Reach out. Stay in touch. I really, Christy and I pray for you guys every day. I hope you're praying for us every day. And I really hope that Christ Church of the Valley stays together during this time, that we don't get to physically be together.